quick. So welcome, everybody. We are going to have a sixth session on introducing the Gospels. And I tried to present this as something that people could join if they have no experience with the Gospels or no idea what the Gospels are. And I know you all well enough to know that that's not going to be the case for all of you, but in case somebody would want to, I just am going to probably go more rudimentary maybe than you all need, and just be ready to answer questions and present some information maybe in a different way. So I'm going to share my screen here. Oh, it's not cooperating already. I don't know. Sometimes Zoom is a good thing and it's very cooperative and it works. And then other times it just doesn't want to show up the way I want it to. All right. Let me try this one more time. There we go. Okay. So,
okay.
This is an introduction to the Gospels. And I'm taking a lot of information from one of my professors, Mark Allen Powell, who is a professor at Trinity Seminary in Columbus, Ohio, where I went. And he wrote this book long ago that I saw it and read it when I was in seminary. And I just looked it up again and purchased it again because I couldn't find my old copy. And he's got it as a revised edition now, or a second edition, where he's made a lot of updates in the last few years about new information and new kinds of studies that have come about the Gospels. So so I want to give all credit where it's due to Mark Powell, because he's quite a good author. And if you're looking for kind of to dig deeper and you want to get into a book, his title is called The Fortress Introduction to the Gospels. So this class course is going to be one that if you miss a course or miss a class, you could pop in the next week and they'll kind of be standalone. But these are the kinds of things that I hope to get to in this class that you might learn in the next 6 weeks. What is a gospel? How did the Gospels come to be written? Why are the Gospels important? Why are they important to Christians and to non-believers? And why does not everyone agree on what the Bible says? Why are there differences of opinion about what the Bible says? What are the different ways that people study the Gospels? And you will be amazed, as I have been amazed, I think, at all the different ways that you can parse out and look at the Gospels. Who were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? How could I figure out what the gospel means? And what's unique about each of the 4 Gospels? Can I tell which one I'm reading from without looking at the title? There are some clues for each gospel writer that make them a little bit distinctive. And when I was in Mark Powell's class, we had a test where certain quotations from different gospels were on the test, and you had to identify which gospel was which, and you can do it if you know some of the kind of characteristics of each of the gospels. And why are there differences between them? And which one is right? Which one is correct? And which version of the Bible is the right one? So these are all things that we're going to get into. Does that sound interesting to people?
Definitely.
All right.
All except for the test part.
All except for the test. Okay.
The test part doesn't maybe sound as exciting.
We won't do a test then.
Okay.
But I hope that you'll at least know a few things that you could ace the test in the end. So we're going to start and do kind of some general talk about the Gospels today. And then over the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at each of the 4 Gospels. And on the last week, we may look a little bit at Gospels that are not found in the Bible. There are a few extra biblical Gospels that we'll talk about what those are and where they came from. And if there's questions along the way, please interrupt me. So the first thing to talk about is, what is a gospel? And most people, if you say, what's a gospel? They're going to answer, well, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, right? Those are the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are stories about Jesus. And all of the New Testament is about Jesus, but the first 4 books are particularly stories about the life of Jesus. And in some cases, the birth of Jesus, and in all cases, the death of Jesus. And in most cases, the resurrection of Jesus. I think in all cases, the resurrection of Jesus. So those particular books are focused around Jesus. But a gospel is also, or the gospel, or a gospel is also a particular kind of writing. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So in Mark Powell's book, he talks about what is the literary form that's closest to what a gospel is. So rather than just say these 4 books are gospels, what is it that makes them a gospel? Or what's different about them from the rest of the books of the Bible that makes them a gospel? And so what's different about these 4 books? So the first, can you guys see this whole screen? I have this, like where I put your, oh, there we go. All right. So on my screen, I have your faces now at the bottom of the screen, and I didn't know if that affected what you saw on the screen or not. So let me try this again. So one of the ways that that a gospel is sometimes looked at outside of Christians is they compare it to historical fiction. So any of you read historical fiction for fun, like novels?
Yep.
I used to read Philippa Gordon, I think is her name.
Yes.
Books
Yeah.
a lot. Yes. And she writes about the wives of Henry VIII, and each one is a different story. So that's historical fiction. So it's based on actual historical figures. It's in the case of the Philippa Gordon books I'm talking about, not about the Bible.
Philippa Gregory.
Gregory, thank you. They're based on actual historical figures. They tell a story that is faithful to the actual life history of the person as we know it, but it fleshes it all out in a way that can't be proven because we don't have anyone alive today who was with the wives of Henry VIII and living with them every day and taking notes or filming and recording. So it's historical in that it's about historical figures. It's fiction in that it's not a eyewitness account or a recording of what happened. So some people suggest that that's what the Gospels are closest to in contemporary literature, is a historical fiction, maybe. Scholars think it's closer to an ancient biography. So in Greek history, especially, biographies were written about the big heroes of the faith or of the time. So whether they're kings or military leaders or whatever, it's a story told to account for the person's life and demonstrate why they're important. So in some ways, that is a close parallel to what a gospel is, that it's a tale told to describe why or show why this person is of importance to an audience that's beyond those who might have known them in person. But what typically is, or maybe is the closest description of what a gospel form is that it's a sermon in story form. And the gospel writers themselves talk about how the reason they're writing the gospels, like at the beginning of Luke's gospel, Luke says, I'm writing this today so that you may know who Jesus is. The writers are trying to convince us of who Jesus is and why Jesus is important. So a gospel is not a reporter's notes. It's not, if when we come to a gospel or read one of the scriptures, one of the books of the first 4 books of the New Testament, as Christians, as people who've grown up in the church, we usually bring to our readings of it a whole story behind it. If we're reading about Jesus for the first, if we pick up the Bible and read a story about Jesus, we know that Jesus was crucified, dies, and was raised to new life. We know that as we're reading the story. We have behind us like a whole like nativity story, maybe from growing up in the faith. But each gospel was written by itself. I mean, each person who wrote the gospels was writing their version of the gospel, not in cooperation with each other. Like, I'm going to tell my story, Mark, you tell your story, and we'll kind of see how they all come out. Like, they were writing in separate times, separate communities. They were writing separately. And it was later on that these 4 books were brought together and held to be holy and true, and shared as more than just stories, but actually scripture. So the gospel writers were independently writing a narrative about Jesus to bring people into faith in Christ. So they are not reporters in the sense that they're telling a story that doesn't have any bias to it. I mean, they're clearly evangelists. They're trying to bring people to faith. So that makes it important to Christians, because they are the kind of key stories and the things that reveal to us who Jesus is and why Jesus is important. And they're also important to non-Christians because Jesus is a confirmed historical figure that is confirmed outside of the Bible as somebody who was born and lived and died and was crucified. That has an external historical reference in somebody named Josephus, who was a historian, a Jewish historian at the time, and doesn't tell the story of Jesus because that's not his motivation, but he refers to Pontius Pilate, who refers to the John known as the Baptizer, and he refers to Jesus of Nazareth. So it's an independently verified source outside of the Christian faith that confirms that Jesus existed and was a doesn't say a lot about him, but it says some things about him. So the other reason that these gospels are so important to us is because they represent the most faithful firsthand accounts that we can find of who Jesus was, what he said, and how he lived. Now, even though they're not like documentaries or filmmaker versions of Jesus' life, they still represent the closest factual historical details that we have about who Jesus is. And so that alone makes them very important to us. And because these stories were known to be true and valuable, they were preserved throughout time. They were copied and shared and eventually became part of what we know as the New Testament. And there were other stories that were not thought to be as faithful, or that were thought to be later written things. They were not as faithful to who Jesus was, that were not included in scripture, but were additional gospel stories written in the first 100 years, for a few hundred years of the Common Era of AD. And so these four are said to be so very important that they were preserved, shared, copied, and set aside by believers for very far back in the church, and came to us today. So I'm going to stop there first and see if you have reactions to that or questions about that, or if that gives you any different thoughts about the Gospels so far.
I had never thought about or even heard about it, Jesus' life being verified outside of the scriptures. I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
Very good.
So I did this last night. You can Google Josephus.
Yeah.
Josephus,
And I've heard of him. I've heard that
Yeah.
name, but I didn't realize that that's what he did, I guess, is
Yeah, I don't know a lot about him, but he wrote extensively about Jewish history and about the time, like his life. I have to go back and look more about Josephus, but he was writing about this time as a fairly contemporary time for him. And he notes Jesus of Nazareth and John and Pontius Pilate, and that Jesus was crucified. I don't know exactly what he says about, I think he says something about that Jesus' followers claim he was resurrected.
And it comes.
But I'm not sure that they say that he was not a Christian himself, so that wasn't a faith claim of his own. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts before we go on? All right. So the word gospel, the English word gospel, comes from the Greek word euangelion, which looks like what English word?
evangelical.
Evangelical, yeah. Evangelion. And this word means good news. So when you read the Gospels, you will see the word gospel mentioned in the gospel, as in Jesus proclaimed the gospel or proclaimed the good news. So clearly Jesus is not proclaiming the book of Mark or the book of John. I mean, so Jesus is not referring to a written manuscript about himself when he is talking about gospel. Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? Okay. So the word gospel actually it was referring to what Jesus preached. Jesus preached the gospel. Jesus preached the good news. So the first references to the word gospel are referring to what Jesus preached. So the next references to what the gospel is, you would find maybe in the first four books of the Bible, but also in like the epistles, like the book of Acts. The disciples shared the good news, shared the gospel with others. And so what they're referring to is not just what Jesus preached. They're referring to the good news that Jesus died and was raised to new life. That's the gospel, that Jesus was crucified, died, and was raised again. So that's the next kind of layer of what gospel has come to mean. Then the next layer is kind of both of those things together. Everything about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, what Jesus preached about, all of that together is the gospel. And then finally it came to be known as the written version of that, of what we know as the four gospels. So I think that could be confusing to people who are seeing, well, Jesus preached the gospel. Well, what? How does that work? How does Jesus preach a book about himself? Yeah, so the word gospel actually means good news, and we kind of use it in all of those different ways when we talk about the gospel. Like, we're sharing the gospel with people, but we're not sharing the Bible with people. We're sharing about who Jesus is and why that matters to us. All right, you all with me?
Yep.
All right. So how did the Gospels come to be? How did they start? Well, they started with, these are the 6 stages that Mark talks about in his book. That the first stage is they started with Jesus. Jesus is an actual person who did things and said things, and people thought it was remarkable. So the gospel started with who Jesus was and is. The next stage were the traditions about Jesus, that people talked about them. So after Jesus died and was raised to new life, people remembered it and they shared it. They told stories about it. They shared their memories. Remember when he was still in Galilee, how he, even in the gospel itself, it talks about how people were remembering him. So they shared those stories orally. And then people also started to write down brief accounts of things Jesus said and did. And this is not something we can prove because we have copies of them, of these things. Like, if you looked at my desk right now, it would demonstrate lots of little notes. Like, I don't want to forget this. Like this Post-it note, for instance, that my desk is covered with these things. So we don't have the little pieces of paper or parchment or whatever, that animal skin, that people would write down these things, because this is very early in the development even of written things. But we have sort of figured this out by virtue of scholarship, looking at what comes later, that people probably started to write down things. Okay, so just trust me on that. All right, so the next thing was the Gospels were composed. So Gospel writers, at least 4 of them that we know of from the scriptures, and others from outside or who were not found in the Bible, started to draw on these traditions, what they heard, what they knew, maybe what they experienced themselves if they were people who knew Jesus personally in life, or maybe a generation later, they heard from, the oldest disciples who were still around, who still knew Jesus. They took snippets of these stories, and they started to put them together in different ways, in at least 4 different ways. And for different reasons, for different audiences, kind of with different goals in mind. And so just for example, really quickly, Luke, the writer of Luke's gospel, focuses a lot on storytelling and Jesus parables. So like the parable of the prodigal son is only found in Luke's gospel. So either that author had heard this story from Jesus himself, or from people who had heard that story from Jesus, or it was written down by somebody else and they went, oh, that's a good story, I'm going to put that here in my gospel. So the gospel writers started to craft their narratives. So we're talking about, like, say, generally 100 years, like the year 100. That's about where we are. So these gospels were written down by the gospel writers, people started to share them, people valued them, people made copies of them and started making, like, distributing them around the area where the church started. So like the Mediterranean, Israel, Greece, around there. So people make copies. So the very oldest copies of such things that we have are very fragile. They are not complete. I think the very oldest, we'll talk about this later, but the very oldest existing fragment of a gospel, I think, is from the Gospel of John and is about the size of a credit card. And that's the only piece from the whole gospel. And it doesn't have even a whole sentence on it, I don't think. But like, knowing that we've seen other later copies of it, we can go back and say, oh yeah, that's from John's gospel. And doing carbon dating and whatever, we can tell it's the oldest. So what we have today are copies of copies of copies that have been shared throughout history until they became preserved enough or sturdy enough that they could make it to our timeline. You know what I'm saying? So I would need to go do some research to see what's the oldest complete copy of Mark's gospel in existence, for instance. And those original copies were written on either parchment, or not parchment, vellum, animal skin, or papyrus scrolls that were made out of like papyrus fibers that were laid over each other, and it's a long process. So those are not like laminated things, you know, those things fall apart and are fragile. So the copies of copies of copies. All right, so then the original gospels were written in the Greek language. That, at least the oldest copies, were written in the Greek language. So people had to translate them, obviously, into languages that other people besides Greek speakers could read. So when you're reading any English Bible, whether it is the King James Version or the New Revised Standard Version, you're reading a translation from Greek. And then finally, the reception. So this is like trying to tell the story of how we get from Jesus to us and how we receive this information. And reception has to do with how people from different places in society hear things differently. So I, as an American 53-year-old seminary trained straight white woman, receive and hear the words of scripture differently than a poor Guatemalan girl of 16 living under occupation, you know? So who we are and how we hear change, and how we understand language, how we understand freedom, how we understand purpose and meaning. All of those things affect how we hear the Gospels. All right, what time do we have? All right, I have a quick 3-minute video I'm going to share that is kind of fun. That's from, that kind of talks about this. Let me pause share. Nope, that's not what I want. Let me stop share. All right, so this video is from the National Geographic, and it's short. I just have to get Zoom to cooperate with me. Share, there it is. Okay.
Along the shores of the Dead Sea, 3 Bedouin shepherds were tending their flocks when one of their goats strayed from the herd. Thinking it had wandered into a cave, one of them threw a stone to scare the animal out. The unexpected sound sparked their curiosity, and inside, the young shepherds uncovered clay jars that contained one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the oldest biblical text ever found, the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls were handwritten some 2,000 years ago on durable animal skin parchment, with a few written on papyrus. They were mostly composed in Hebrew from right to left, with sheets written in columns, then sewn together, creating a single scroll. For safekeeping, some of them would be wrapped in linen and encapsulated in tall jars. The scroll was eventually replaced by the Codex as the format for Christian manuscripts. They were made by folding sheets of papyrus and stitching them together. As time passed, codices began to grow larger and more complex. During the medieval period, books were reproduced by hand. Monks spent their days copying texts in Latin and Greek, while others illustrated the pages. It was a grueling process that required great skill and training. The books were very expensive. To illuminate the text, they used various pigments and gold leaf. And the pages could require the hides of hundreds of sheep or calves. But it was the introduction of the printing press that transitioned the Bible from the Middle Ages into the early modern world. This invention revolutionized book production, ultimately making the Bible available to the masses. Today, it is the best-selling book of all time. Inside its pages, you can find the stories of the creation of the world, Noah's Ark and the flood, Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, the construction of Solomon's temple, the birth of Jesus, his crucifixion and resurrection, the Holy Spirit coming to the apostles, and many more. Large portions of these biblical stories are represented in 400 of the oldest manuscripts studied so far. Although a few are complete, most are either incomplete or fragments. Today, the search for more manuscripts continues. What other treasures, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, are yet to be found?
So hang on. I'm still hearing that. I don't know if you are. There we go. I was just Googling to see if I thought that I'd read something earlier this week about another manuscript or scroll being found in one of the caves. There's like hundreds of caves that are kind of high up on these bluffs in this part of Israel where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I couldn't find the resource, so I don't know if I'd seen an old post or what, but I mean, they're still finding scrolls today. All right, I'm going to go back to any comments before I move on. I'll see if I can find my thing again. So I think it's interesting to hear the different ways that that scriptures have been studied. So that's what we're going to look at next. Slideshow, here we go. All right, let's get through this one again. All right, so how scholars examine and research the Gospels. So now I don't see you guys anymore, so let me know if, wave a hand or chat if you need something. All right, so these are just some samples of the kinds of research that are done by people today. So there's historical Jesus studies. And Albert Schweitzer was someone who did historical Jesus studies. That's a name you might know. But there are contemporary people too. And these are historians or scholars who are trying to sift through the Gospels and ferret out what they think is actually the things that Jesus said, the historical Jesus said, versus the things that were remembered about him, or the things that maybe the early church wanted Jesus to say, or kind of put into Jesus' mouth. So I know that can be like a startling thing to hear, but maybe not everything that is found in the scriptures today is actually something that Jesus said. That's what these studies are trying to sift through. And one of the ways or the criteria that they use to try to figure out, is this something Jesus has really said or not, is to think about, well, one, is this like consistent with the rest of the things that we believe Jesus has really said? So if it's kind of whack-a-mole, they might say, yeah, that seems out of character. They also might say, okay, this story does not make sense. Like we can't figure out what Jesus might have said, or what Jesus might have like gained by saying these words. That's actually a clue to these researchers that Jesus probably actually said it. Because if it were something that that made perfect sense, or that somehow furthered the goals of the church or whatever, then you could suppose, well, maybe it was something that the early church or the early writers like nudged a little bit to be more palatable to more people. But the fact that it's so whack-a-mole, or it actually works against more people understanding Jesus or coming to believe in Jesus, may mean that it's actually more authentic. So that's kind of that's one of the criteria that they use. So that's historical Jesus studies. All right, come on, move forward. There we go. Okay, source criticism tries to look at the different gospels and say, okay, these gospels have virtually word for word the same thing in this part. So we think maybe there was a source that they both had when they were writing their gospels. So this would be the case for Luke and Matthew, that have a lot of similar material that's not found in the other two. So maybe they had some pre-written thing or snippets of things that they both used, and they used in maybe different ways. So source criticism is kind of looking at what are the different pieces that might have gone into making up the different gospels, and which one was first, or which one like came before others and got built on or changed. So that's source criticism. Form criticism is looking at the different kinds of writing that you find in the narratives. So in the Gospel of Luke, we have hymns like the Magnificat. It's as a form known as a hymn, not like in the hymnal hymn, but the one that we sing for Advent. My soul proclaims your greatness, O God, and my spirit rejoices in you. That comes from the Magnificat in Luke's gospel. That is probably a piece that existed before, or else Luke was a really good hymn writer. It's hard to know. So form criticism looks at like the different kinds of writings that you find, and looks at, well, how did this writer use this miracle? And what are they trying to say by putting it in this place? Another example is the story of Jesus entering Jerusalem on the donkey, which we read for Palm Sunday, and happens right before Holy Week. I mean, we read Palm Sunday, so it happens right before those events in most of the Gospels. In one Gospel, and now I can't remember which one, that story comes at the beginning of the Gospel, before Jesus like Jesus, one of the early trips of Jesus to Jerusalem. So what was that gospel writer trying to do by put it there, is what a form critic would be researching. Are you still with me?
Yes.
Okay, so this is, I think, the last slide I have. Just to give you a couple more examples. So text critics are looking at the oldest copies of the Gospels we have and comparing them, and like, why is it that sometimes they're different from each other? Did an early copyist try to fix something that they thought was wrong and change it? Or did they copy it wrong? Like, there are some old copies of old manuscripts where the person who was copying it wrote in the margins, the light is bad. Maybe they were writing it to the person next to them, like, the light is not good here. You know, like, I need a lamp, I need another candle or whatever. So they wrote it kind of in the margins. Well, then the next person who was copying that manuscript didn't know, is that part of the manuscript, or is it something that the last monk just added? So they actually put it into their copy of the gospel. At that point, it says the light is not good. So as later scholars are looking at it, they're like, that does not make sense. Why that would be right there. We think that's a text error. So they're making determinations of, this gospel or this version is probably older and more correct than this one. That's text criticism. Translation studies are looking at different Bible translations through the years and how it went from Greek to English, say. Some translations are trying to translate as much as possible word for word, and some are trying to translate it to be like the gist of what was said, which makes more sense not being word for word. So they're kind of looking at how those work. And sometimes they're looking at how language itself has changed in the meantime, like the word for homosexual appears like in the last 100 years as part of a translation, but doesn't appear in earlier translations. They've used a different word. So what does that do, and how does that change the way we see the Bible? That's translation studies. There's one more, reader response. That's looking at how one person hears the same story differently than another person because of who we are. And so there are lots of different biblical critics or biblical commentaries from different perspectives, from a liberation theologist or an evangelical perspective or feminist criticism or whatever. And they're looking at how these different things sound different depending on who you are. And then finally, narrative criticism is looking at like, how is each gospel in itself like a short story, and how does an author kind of communicate something through the way they've arranged the story itself. All right, I'm going to stop there because I'm at my time. But those, just to give you a sample of how scholars look and kind of tease out the different meanings of scripture, it can get very complicated, and there's so many different angles and ways to look at things. There's kind of no end to it's you never step in the same river twice. That's true of the Gospels, because it's always changing. There's always new insights. So I'm going to stop there because I'm at my time. Next week, we're going to look at Mark's Gospel. You don't have to read all of Mark's Gospel, but if you want to pick it up and just look at it, look at how it starts, how it ends, maybe how long it is, those would be kind of easy homework to do before we get there. Any final questions if you've got another minute? Or comments?
Well,
Thank you.
Yes. Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, okay. I heard another voice in there somewhere. I was just wondering what these other seminaries are teaching then, those more evangelical or even some of the other Lutheran seminaries, what, because they're saying that the Bible is word for word truth. What are they actually teaching then?
Yeah, so some other Lutheran traditions like Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod traditions and seminaries, they teach basically their perspective on these matters. This is the one way to interpret it. And they don't teach a lot of text criticism or historical criticism where you're kind of teasing out, well, I would say they kind of take it more at face value. They have like one particular translation that they say this is the translation you should use, and it says what it says, and so you should be able to figure it out because it says what it says. And it's more of the case in seminaries in general, Protestant seminaries in general, that they're teaching historical criticism or what I just shared with you. At least to share that that's there and that there are multiple ways of looking at scripture. And there's not one like single way of interpreting things. Any other quick comments or questions before we go? I hope that was interesting and illuminating a little bit.
Yeah.
And feel free to text me this week if you want to, or email me or talk to me next weekend if you want to ask anything, and we'll come back to it next week.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for coming. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.